He didn't even look up when she walked in. That was the part that broke something in Nia Carter that night. Not the woman sitting across from her husband, not the champagne open on the coffee table, not even the way Kang Jae-yoon's hand rested so casually on the stranger's knee like it had rested there 100 times before. It was the fact that he didn't look up, like she was furniture. Like 8 months of carrying his child had made her invisible in her own home. Nia stood in the doorway of the Gangnam penthouse for exactly 4 seconds. She counted them. Then she stepped back into the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and watched the doors close on the life she thought she had. She didn't cry until she reached the street, and even then she stopped herself after 20 seconds. She had work to do. If you've ever had to smile through the worst moment of your life, because breaking down wasn't an option, this story is for you. Before we go any further, if you're watching this and you believe that every woman deserves to be seen, not just tolerated, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. And if this opening already has your heart racing, hit like because what's coming will shake you to your core. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Nia Carter had not planned to fall in love with a man like Kang Jae-hyun. She had planned, quite specifically, to spend her late 20s in Seoul as a forensic financial consultant attached to an international advisory firm, do her 3-year contract, learn enough Korean to survive a convenience store, and go home to Atlanta with a good resume and a story about living abroad. That was the plan. Neat. Executable. Plans in Nia's experience had a way of meeting the wrong man in the wrong hallway at exactly the wrong moment. The hallway in question had been on the 14th floor of a Mapo-gu office tower 3 years ago, during what was supposed to be a routine audit consultation that turned out to be anything but routine. She had been standing outside a conference room at 11:15 in the morning, reading through a sheet on her tablet, when a door opened and a man walked out of it and nearly knocked her off her feet. She'd grabbed her tablet. He'd grabbed her elbow. Their eyes had met for about 1 second before both of them looked away. Sorry, she'd said, in English, because her Korean that week was still mostly survival level. My fault, he'd said, in English, without any particular accent, and walked away. She hadn't thought much of it. Dark suit, sharp face, the kind of jaw that looked like someone had drawn it with a ruler. She'd filed him away under tall Korean man in a good suit and moved on with her morning. It was only later, when she mentioned the near collision to her Korean colleague Soo Yeon over lunch, that Soo Yeon had set down her chopsticks very carefully and said, "You ran into Kang Jae-hyun." Who's that? The look Soo Yeon gave her was the kind of look you give someone who has just asked what a red traffic light means. He owns half of everything in this building. Nia had shrugged. He should watch where he's walking then. Soo Yeon stared at her for a long moment. Then she started laughing quietly and a little nervously, like she wasn't sure if the joke was funny or dangerous. Nia found out which one it was about 2 weeks later, when Kang Jae-hyun walked into the advisory firm's office, sat down across from her, and hired her personally to consult on a set of financial restructuring documents that were apparently too sensitive for the usual team. He hadn't mentioned that they'd met. He hadn't acknowledged the hallway at all. He had simply opened a folder, placed it on the desk between them, and said, "I was told you're thorough." "I am," she said. "I was also told you don't scare easily." She'd looked at him across the desk, the jaw, the stillness of him, the way he sat like a man who had never once in his life felt the need to make himself smaller to fit a room, and said, "Define easily." Something shifted in his expression then, not quite a smile. More like the beginning of one that he had decided, at the last moment, not to finish. That was she would later understand, as close to charmed as Kang Jae-hyun ever let himself look in public. The work was legitimate. She checked. She always checked. The financial restructuring was real. The documents were dense but coherent, and the questions he asked her were sharp in the way that only genuinely intelligent people ask sharp questions not to impress, but because they actually needed the answers. She spent 6 weeks on the project. By the 3rd week, he was stopping by her office at odd hours, with follow-up questions that didn't always have much to do with the documents. By the 5th week, she had started to understand that Kang Jae-hyun's financial empire was not the entirety of what he ran. By the 6th week, She was in love with him in that specific, helpless way that she hated most, the way where you know exactly how stupid it is, and you do it anyway, because the feeling has already moved in and rearranged all the furniture in your chest. He asked her to dinner on the last day of the contract. She said yes before she'd finished deciding to. Their relationship existed for the first year in a kind of parallel universe that Nia constructed very carefully for herself. She knew what he was. She was not naive. She had seen enough of his organization's financial architecture to understand that legitimate business was only one layer of a structure that went considerably deeper. She had also seen, in those 6 weeks, a man who protected the people around him with a ferocity that was almost frightening, who paid for things she never asked him to pay for without ever making her feel like a debt, and who listened to her, actually listened, the way almost no one did when she spoke. She told herself she understood the risk. She told herself she kept her eyes open. Maybe she had, maybe she hadn't. Maybe it didn't matter. Because the morning Jae-hyun had shown up at her apartment with a ring, he'd clearly chosen himself, not delegated, assigned, actually chosen. She could tell because it was slightly wrong in exactly the right way. Stone just a degree off-center in its setting. She had said yes to that too. They married in a small ceremony that Jae-hyun had insisted on keeping private. No press, no display. Just a handful of people who mattered, in a room that was quieter than anything else in his life. Nia had worn ivory. Her mother had flown in from Atlanta and spent the whole night watching Jae-hyun the way a woman watches a weather system she doesn't entirely trust. "He loves you," her mother had said, at the end of the night. Not as a compliment. More like an observation that carried its own warning inside it. "I know," Nia said. "Men like that," her mother said, and didn't finish the sentence. Nia had filled in the blank herself, quietly, on the flight back. Men like that love hard and they love specific, and when they decide something is theirs, they don't let it go. She had thought at the time that the last part was the comfort. She understood now that it was the warning. The first year of the marriage had been by any honest measure good. Not perfect. Nia did not deal in perfect. Jae-hyun worked hours that would have destroyed a lesser man, came home late more nights than not, carried stress in his shoulders like it was load-bearing, and he couldn't put it down. He was not, in the domestic sense, easy. He forgot things. Bad at small talk. When something was bothering him, he went quiet in a way that felt like a door shutting rather than a person thinking, and Nia had to learn slowly. The difference between the quiet that meant give me space and the quiet that meant I need someone to knock. But he showed up. That was the thing about Jae-hyun that nobody on the outside would ever understand. Behind the closed doors of their life together, he showed up in ways that mattered. He learned how she took her coffee, and he made it himself on the mornings he was home. He remembered the names of her colleagues and asked about them by name weeks later, which nobody ever did. When her father had a health scare the spring after the wedding, Jae-hyun had arranged for a specialist in Atlanta to see him within 48 hours, without being asked, without making it a production. Just done it and mentioned it quietly over dinner, like it was nothing. It was not easy, but he was present, and for a long time that had been enough. The pregnancy had not been planned, not unplanned. Either they had talked about children in the abstract, in that careful way that people in complicated lives talk about wanting things that would make the complication worth it. When Nia found out, sitting in their Gangnam penthouse bathroom on a Tuesday morning with a test in her hand, she had felt two things simultaneously, a terror so clean it was almost clarifying, and something underneath it that she identified slowly as joy. She had waited to tell him. She wasn't sure why exactly. Some instinct she didn't fully trust told her to wait until she was certain, until the doctor had confirmed it, until she had a photograph in hand, something real and undeniable she could place in front of him. So she had kept it. 8 weeks, then 12, then past the point where you stop holding your breath. She had watched her body change in the mirror and said nothing, wearing cuts of clothing that kept the secret for a little longer, feeling the weight of it in a way that was not quite dishonest. She was going to tell him. She was always going to tell him, but was also not entirely something she could explain. It was while she was waiting that she started to notice the distance. It came on slowly, the way cold fronts come. You don't notice the temperature dropping until the moment you realize you're shivering, and have been for a while. Jae-hyun had always been a man of controlled silences, but these silences felt different. more deliberate. He came home later. He took calls in the other room with the door closed, which he had never done before. When she touched him in the mornings, he responded correctly: warmth, attention, the right gestures. But there was something underneath it that felt like performance, like a man playing a part he'd forgotten. He used to just live naturally. Nia noticed. She was, professionally and personally, a woman who noticed things. Filed it. She didn't confront it. She told herself she was hormonal, told herself the stress of the organization was cyclical, told herself she was reading patterns into ordinary behavior because she was scared and small and 8 months pregnant and emotionally exhausted. She almost believed herself. The night she came home with the ultrasound photograph, she had been planning to tell him everything. She had the photo in her coat pocket, slightly bent at one corner from where she'd folded it too quickly. Practiced, in the car, a version of the conversation where she walked in, asked him to sit down, and placed the picture in front of him. She had practiced his face in her mind, the way his control would slip, for just a moment, the way he would look at her differently when he understood that the thing growing in her body was real. She had planned all of this very carefully. She had not planned for the woman on the couch. Penthouse elevator opened directly into the main living space. It was the kind of detail that Jae-yoon had chosen because he liked controlled entry points. He always knew who was arriving, had always heard the elevator before it opened. Nia knew this. She had thought of it in the elevator and decided it didn't matter. She was his wife. She was coming home. The doors opened at 9:47 in the evening. Jae-yoon was sitting on the long white sofa near the floor-to-ceiling windows. The rain had been hitting the glass all evening. Seoul in October, the way it always was, persistent and gray. He had his jacket off, his shirt collar loose, a glass of whiskey on the table beside him that was mostly empty. These were ordinary things. These were the bones of 1,000 Tuesday evenings. The woman sitting across from him, close enough that her knee nearly touched his, was not ordinary. She was Korean, early 30s probably, with the kind of maintained beauty that costs money and attention. Her hair was down. She had her shoes off. Her shoes off, that detail, hit Nia somewhere specific and terrible, because you don't take your shoes off in a stranger's home. You take your shoes off in a place where you feel comfortable, in a place you've been before. There was a bottle of champagne on the coffee table. Open, nearly half gone. Jae-yoon did not look up when the elevator opened. He was saying something low. In Korean, his voice in a register Nia recognized as the one he used when he was being careful with someone. His hand was not on the woman's knee. His hand was near it. 3 inches, maybe 4. Close enough to be intentional. Nia counted 4 seconds. She was aware in those 4 seconds of the weight of the photograph in her coat pocket. The slight bend in its corner. The blurry gray image of a human being, the size of a lemon who had her nose, and according to the doctor, his brow. She was aware of the rain. She was aware of the champagne. She was aware that she was standing in the elevator doorway in a coat she'd had since before the pregnancy that no longer buttoned properly over her stomach, and that neither of the people in her living room had looked at her. Then Jae-yoon looked up. The thing that happened in his face in that moment, she memorized it. She filed it somewhere cold and precise. It was not guilt, exactly. It was something worse than guilt. It was the face of a man who had calculated the probability of being caught and decided it was low, and was now recalculating in real time. He started to say her name. She stepped back into the elevator. She pressed the lobby button. She watched his face, the recalculation still happening, the sentence still forming as the doors closed between them. She did not cry in the elevator. She had learned, somewhere in the last 8 months, that certain kinds of grief needed a private address. She walked for 40 minutes in the rain before she got into the first cab she could find. She didn't have a destination. She gave the driver a district mappo because she'd once had a colleague there whose apartment she had visited twice and whose building lobby had benches. She sat in the back of the cab with her coat pulled closed as far as it would go and her hand pressed flat against the side of her stomach, and she thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. The photograph was still in her pocket. She had not left it. She had not dropped it on the floor of the elevator or left it on the table in the lobby as she walked through. She had not done anything dramatic with it. She had simply kept it in her pocket because the child in it was still hers regardless of what the child's father had just been doing. She had her phone. She had her wallet. She had the financial access codes to 3 accounts she had set up in her own name over the previous 6 months, an action she had taken not out of suspicion, but out of the specific professional knowledge that women in complicated marriages needed to know where they stood financially, at all times, independent of whatever else was true. She had done this quietly in the margins of her own professional work, and had told no one. She had also, over the previous 3 months, been doing something else. She had been keeping records, not because she had known exactly what she was looking for. She was a forensic financial consultant. Her brain found patterns the way other brains found faces. She had started noticing anomalies in the periphery of Jae-hyun's financial structure, small irregularities in account movements, transfer patterns that didn't match the organizational logic she understood, numbers that appeared in reports and then did not appear in corresponding records. She had not been looking for an affair. She had been looking at money, because money was what she knew. What she had found over 3 months of careful attention was considerably more than an affair. Park Min-suk was Jae-hyun's most trusted lieutenant. He had been with the organization for 11 years. He was at every dinner, in every strategy conversation, the man Jae-hyun called first when something went wrong, and last when something went right. Because that was the specific intimacy of genuine trust, the person you credit with crises but assume in successes. Nia had met Min-sik dozens of times. He was polite, attentive, possessed of the particular Korean corporate courtesy that could look like warmth if you didn't notice the calculations running behind it. Nia had noticed the calculations. She just hadn't known until 3 months ago what they were calculating toward. Min-sik was stealing, not in the blunt amateur way. He was stealing with the precision of someone who understood the architecture well enough to move money through it without disturbing the surface. Small enough amounts from any single account to fall below the flag thresholds. Enough accounts to add up to something substantial. A pattern that, viewed in isolation, looked like normal operational variance. Viewed whole, over time, the way Nia viewed it, told a different story. And then there was the woman. Nia had not known, when she first pulled the thread, that it would connect to her personal life. She had found the connection 3 weeks ago, and she had sat with it for 3 weeks without moving, turning it over, verifying it, making absolutely certain she was reading it correctly. The woman's name was Bae Soo-jin. She worked for one of the subsidiary companies under Min-sik's operational umbrella. She had been, according to the financial records Nia had traced, receiving payments from a shell account that Min-sik controlled. The payments were regular, and they had started, according to the dates, approximately 8 months ago. 8 months ago was when Jae-hyun had started coming home later, when the silences changed quality. Min-sik had not simply arranged for his boss to have an affair. He had arranged an affair with a woman he controlled financially, in a situation he could monitor, at a time when Jae-hyun's wife was pregnant and emotionally isolated, and from the outside, a softer target than she had ever been. He was manufacturing instability around Jae-hyun, creating a vulnerability, softening the foundation of the man's personal life, while quietly dismantling the financial architecture that supported his power. And he had, Nia suspected, underestimated her entirely. She sat in the lobby of the Mapo building with her hand on her stomach and her phone screen lit in her lap, and she thought about what she had just seen in her husband's face. The recalculation. The sentence that had begun to form and been cut off by elevator doors. He would look for her tonight. She was certain of that. Jae-hyun was not a man who tolerated uncertainty in his own home. She had approximately 6 hours before that search became organized. The cab driver who took her from Mapo to the Yongsan district did not ask any questions. He was an older man, probably mid-60s, who drove with the quiet competence of someone who had been doing the same thing for decades, and had learned that passengers who needed silence were always easier than passengers who wanted conversation. Nia appreciated him more than she could have said. She checked into a business hotel under her legal name, not her married name. Kangni existed in databases she could not fully predict. Carter Naya existed in a passport and a prior professional life and a set of financial accounts that bore her mother's city as a password hint. The room was small and clean, and nobody she knew would think to look there. She set her coat over the chair. The photograph fell out of the pocket onto the floor, face down. She left it there for a moment, looking at its blank white back, and then she picked it up and placed it on the desk. She opened her laptop. She had work to do. The records she'd been compiling on Minsuk were not yet complete. She was missing 2 months of transfer data from a secondary account she'd only recently identified. She was also missing confirmation of the connection between the affair arrangement and Minsuk's operational timeline, something she suspected existed in the communication logs of a subsidiary server that she had peripheral access to through her old consulting credentials. She had been careful over the previous months not to pull any of these threads too hard, too fast. She had been waiting until she had enough, not just enough to be certain herself, but enough that the picture was complete and undeniable, and could not be dismissed by someone whose instinct was to protect the structure over the truth. She was close. 2 weeks away, maybe 3. She didn't have 2 weeks anymore. She opened the transfer records and got to work. She worked for 3 hours without stopping, cross-referencing accounts, flagging transactions, building the timeline from the bottom up. The rain was still going outside the window. The city made its nighttime sounds. At some point, she realized she was hungry and ordered delivery from a place that would accept app payment and leave the bag outside the door, and she ate at the desk without tasting any of it because her brain was somewhere else. At 2:17 in the morning, her phone lit up with Jae-hyun's number. She watched it ring. She watched it stop. She set the phone face down on the desk beside the photograph and went back to the records. By 3 in the morning, she had what she needed on the secondary account. By 4, she had the confirmation of the communication connection, not the content of the messages, but the metadata pattern, dates and durations that aligned precisely with her timeline. By 4:45, she had a complete and documented picture of Park Min-sik's operation, the theft, the timeline, the manufactured affair, the woman he controlled, the instability he had been deliberately engineering around the man who trusted him most. He saved it in 4 places. 3 cloud locations with access credentials that existed only in her own memory. 1 encrypted drive that she carried in her bag. Then she sat back in the desk chair and looked at the photograph. Her daughter. The doctor had confirmed it 2 days ago. A girl. She put her hand flat on her stomach and held it there. "I know," she said, to no one in particular, or to the only person who counted right now. "I know, we're going to be okay." She wasn't certain of that yet. But she said it the way you say things that need to become true, not as a lie, but as a direction. Outside, the Seoul rain finally began to ease. She did not sleep. She had calls to make before the city woke up. There was a woman named Han Ji-young who had been Nia's closest thing to a confidant in Seoul. Not a close friend in the American sense, Ji-young was Korean, mid-40s, a former tax attorney who had pivoted to private consulting after a divorce that had, by Ji-young's own accounting, cost her everything except her competence and her address book. They had met through a professional network dinner 8 months into Nia's marriage and had found, over a series of lunches, that they spoke the same language underneath their different actual languages, the language of women who were very good at their work, and were tired of having that treated as incidental. Nia called her at 6 in the morning. Ji-young answered on the second ring, which told Nia that Ji-young had seen Jae-hyun's name in enough context to understand that a 6a M call from his wife was not a social call. "I need a few days," Nia said, "and I need a property recommendation outside Seoul. Busan area, ideally. Something private, something that's not connected to anything with my married name." Pause. "Short, are you safe?" "Yes, the kind of not safe I'm dealing with isn't that kind." Another pause. "How many days? As many as I need to finish something." Ji-young did not ask what the something was. This was one of the things Nia valued most about her. "I have a cousin in Gijong," Ji-young said. "Small coastal property. She uses it in summer, but it's empty now. I can call her at 7. I'll need to get there without using anything traceable. Train to Busan, cash ticket, bus from the station. My cousin can meet you." Nia looked at the photograph on the desk. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Ji-young said. "Tell me when you're there." She was at Seoul Station by 7:30. She bought a ticket with cash she had taken from the business hotel ATM using her Atlanta-era debit card. She sat in the train's quiet car and watched Seoul pull away through the window, the city still gray and wet from the previous night's rain, the light coming up slow and reluctant over the buildings. She thought about Jae-hyun waking up in the penthouse. She thought about the moment when he realized she was not there, not in the bedroom, not in the bathroom, not somewhere in the apartment being quietly furious, which would have been the expected move. She thought about him checking the elevator logs, the building CCTV, the car service, the contacts. She thought about the specific look that would cross his face when none of it led anywhere. She felt briefly something complicated about that, not satisfaction exactly, but the particular clarity that comes when the thing you have been managing in silence finally stops being silent and becomes something you can actually do something about. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the train window. Her daughter pressed back, or seemed to, a small internal movement she had been feeling for 3 weeks now. "I know," she said again, too quietly for anyone near her to hear. "I'm working on it." The train moved south through the morning. Seoul disappeared behind her. And in the penthouse in Gangnam, Kang Jae-hyun stood in a living room that no longer had a woman in it, the wrong woman gone, the right woman gone. The champagne still sitting on the table the night before, and understood, for the first time in his adult life, that he was standing in a mess entirely of his own making. The question now was whether he was the kind of man who could clean it up. He did not know the answer yet. He reached for his phone and called Min-suk. And Min-sis, on the other end of the line, answered on the first ring with a voice that held exactly the right amount of concern and not one genuine feeling underneath it. Min-suk answered on the first ring. That was the first thing wrong. Jae-hyun had called at 6:42 in the morning, which was not a normal hour for a social call. And a man who answered a call like that on the first ring at 6:42 in the morning was either a man who hadn't slept or a man who had been waiting for the phone to ring. Jae-hyun stood in the middle of his living room with the champagne bottle still on the coffee table. He hadn't touched it, hadn't cleaned up any of it, had spent the night in a version of the penthouse that felt like a stage set after the audience had gone home and registered the speed of the answer without saying anything about it. "Boss." Min-suk's voice was warm and careful in exactly the correct proportions. "It's early. Nia's gone a beat. 1 second, maybe slightly less." "Gone how?" "She came home last night. She saw something she shouldn't have seen. She left." Jae-hyun paused. "She hasn't come back." "Did she call anyone?" The question came too fast. Jae-hyun noticed it, the way you notice a step that's slightly shorter than the others, on a staircase, not enough to fall, but enough to break rhythm. Filed it. "I don't know yet," he said. "I need eyes on the building CCTV from last night. I need the car service logs. I need someone at the airport by 8. "I'll handle it," Min-sik said. "She's probably at a hotel. She'll cool down and come back. She's 8 months pregnant." "I know." Another carefully measured pause. "I'll get people moving. Give me an hour." Jae-hyun ended the call and stood very still for a moment, looking at the window. The rain had stopped some time before dawn. The city outside was the color of old concrete, the light coming up flat and pale over the Gangnam skyline. He thought about the look on Nia's face in the elevator doorway. No, that was the wrong word. There had been no look. That was exactly the problem. He had seen her face for perhaps 2 seconds before the doors closed, and what he had seen was not anger or tears, or the kind of betrayed fury that a man could work with, could argue against, could navigate. What he had seen was nothing. Her face had been entirely still. Her eyes had been on him for those 2 seconds, with an expression so controlled, it was almost worse than any expression he could have named, and then she had stepped back and the elevator had taken her. He had dealt with dangerous people his entire adult life. He understood in his body, and not just his head, the difference between a person who was reacting and a person who had already decided. Nia had already decided something. He didn't know what it was. That was the thing keeping his chest tight. He went to the bedroom and changed his shirt, which was the only concession he made to the night having passed. He didn't shower. He didn't eat. Came back to the living room and picked up the champagne bottle and took it to the kitchen and set it down next to the sink without pouring it out, because pouring it out felt like a gesture towards something he didn't have time for. Called his driver. He was in the car by 7:15. The building's security office was managed by a man named Oh Sung-woo, who had worked for Jae-hyun for 6 years, and who understood precisely what it meant when his employer showed up in person before 8 in the morning with his collar not quite straight and his eyes carrying the particular flatness of a man running on no sleep and controlled adrenaline. Sung-woo did not say good morning. He pulled up the CCTV archive without being asked. Jae-hyun stood behind him and watched the footage from the lobby camera. 9:44, 9:45. There the elevator doors opening, Nia walking through. Coat. The slight forward lean she'd developed in the last 2 months, the way her center of gravity had shifted. He watched her cross the lobby, the way her stride was completely even. No stumble, no hesitation, like a woman who had made a decision before she finished moving. She pushed through the main doors. The external camera caught her for about 30 seconds before she turned a corner. "Can you get the street cameras?" Jae-hyun asked. "I can pull the Gangnam District feed, but it'll take." "Do it." It took 22 minutes. The Gangnam District traffic cameras caught her half a block down, walking in the rain with her hand at her side and her coat collar pulled up. She hailed a cab 4 minutes later. Sungwoo ran the plates. The cab company's dispatch log showed the destination as Mapo-gu, Mangwon area, dropped at a building on a residential street. Jae-hyun had a man there within 15 minutes. The building had no guest log. The lobby benches were empty. No one in the immediate area had seen a pregnant black woman in the last several hours. The cab driver, reached by phone, confirmed the drop-off but said the woman had not told him anything else and had paid cash. Cash. Nia had paid cash. Jae-hyun sat in the back of his car outside the Mapo building and considered that detail. He knew his wife's habits. She used the same 3 cards for everything. Organized by category the way she organized every financial thing in her life: groceries on one, professional expenses on another, personal purchases on a third. Carried minimal physical cash because she found it inefficient. Cash meant she had prepared for something. He called Min-suk again. "Paid cash for a cab in Mangwon last night," he said. "Check if she took any cash withdrawals in the last week. Check all accounts, including anything under her maiden name." This time the pause was longer. Her maiden name accounts would require. "I know what they require." "Do it, boss." A brief hesitation that Jae-hyun clocked and filed without comment. "If she had accounts under her maiden name that you didn't know about, that's unusual." "Yes," Jae-hyun said. "It is." He ended the call. He sat in the car for a moment and thought about that. About a woman who had been quietly maintaining financial independence under a name that did not belong to their marriage. A woman who had paid cash for a cab at 10 at night while 8 months pregnant and had not called anyone he knew about and had not gone anywhere his people could find her. He thought about when that preparation had begun. How long she had been thinking about an exit while he had been doing what he'd been doing. The tightness in his chest shifted into something that felt less like fear and more like the spasmosnausea of a man, beginning to see the shape of what he'd actually done. Min-sik arrived at the Gangnam office at 9:30 with 3 of his own people and a set of printed reports that he placed on the conference table with the efficiency of a man who had been preparing them for longer than the morning. Jae-hyun looked at the reports and then looked at the 3 men Min-suk had brought and said calmly, "Send them out." Min-sik did. They went without question, which was correct. This was not a meeting for subordinates. The 2 men sat across from each other at the long table. Jae-hyun had a coffee he wasn't drinking. Min-sik had nothing, which was unusual for him. He was a man who was always doing something with his hands, always holding a pen or a phone or a cup. Today his hands were flat on the table. "The airport shows nothing," Min-sik said. "No international departures under either name. No domestic either. I checked the KTX reservations under her full married name." "She would have paid cash," Jae-hyun said. "At the station. Possibly under her maiden name, Carter." Min-suk nodded slowly, like he was hearing the name for the first time. "I can check the station CCTV. It'll take a few hours." "How many hours?" "By early afternoon." Jae-hyun looked at him. Looked. The way he looked at things he was assessing, not hostile, just measuring. Min-sik held the look with the ease of a man who had been doing it for 11 years. He was very good at being looked at. "Min-suk," Jae-hyun said. "Boss. Last night. You called me at 9:15 to confirm the inventory meeting rescheduled for Thursday." "That's right. You called from your desk phone." "Yes. You were at the office at 9:15 last night. Working late. You know how the Thursday accounts run." Jae-hyun picked up his coffee, put it down without drinking it. "Nia came home at 9:47, 32 minutes after your call." Min-sik's expression was exactly correct. Attentive. Slightly concerned. The expression of a man following a thought process he hadn't arrived at yet. "Okay. The woman in my apartment last night. You know her." not a question. Jae-hyun watched Min-suk's face for the fraction of a second before the man assembled his response. There, the calculation. Brief, barely visible. But Jae-hyun had been watching Min-suk's face across tables for 11 years, and he knew the difference between a man thinking and a man deciding what to say. I've met her, Min-suk said carefully. She works in the Sinchon subsidiary. Events coordination. You introduced us at the Mapo dinner in March. You seemed a slight pause. She approached you. I didn't think... You didn't think what? The question hung. Min-suk looked at the table for a moment. When he looked up, his face had shifted not to guilt exactly, but to something more carefully constructed. Concern, loyalty, the performance of a man who was worried about his boss in a human, straightforward way. I should have said something, Min-suk said. When I realized it had continued. I didn't think it was my place. Jae-hyun held very still. You knew it had continued. I heard things. I didn't confirm them. For how long? Min-suk let out a breath. 6 months, maybe 7. 6 months. 7 months. Jae-hyun heard the number and did not move and did not change his expression and thought very specifically about Nia's face in the elevator doorway. Stillness of it. The decision that was already made. She had been living with whatever she knew for considerably longer than last night. You should have told me, Jae-hyun said. You're right, Min-suk said, with exactly enough weight in his voice to sound sincere. I'm sorry. Jae-hyun looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded once and picked up the printed reports. Find her. That's the only priority right now. Min-suk stood. I'll have something by afternoon. He left. Jae-hyun waited until he heard the outer door close, and then he set the reports back down on the table and put both hands flat on its surface and looked at nothing for a long time. He was not a man who worked from instinct alone. He worked from patterns. And the pattern of this conversation had something in it that he couldn't name yet, but that sat wrong in his chest. The way a loose tooth sits wrong in your mouth, not dangerous on its own, but a signal that something underneath has already shifted. Min-suk had said I heard things, not I suspected. Not I wondered, I heard things. From whom? Across the city, in a hotel in Yongsan, that Jae-hyun's people would not find before noon. At the earliest, Nico was on her 3rd call of the morning. The first had been to Ji-young, confirming the Gajong arrangement. The second had been to a lawyer, not a sole lawyer, not anyone connected to Jae-hyun's orbit, but an international legal consultant based in Singapore whose number Nia had kept for 2 years in a contacts list under a decoy name. Call had lasted 11 minutes. The lawyer had asked 3 questions, received clear answers to all 3, and said he'd have preliminary documents ready within 48 hours. The 3rd call was to her mother. Her mother answered with the particular composure of a woman who had been expecting a call like this since the wedding and had made peace with that expectation without letting it become defeat. I'm okay, Nia said immediately. The baby's okay. I know you're okay. Her mother's voice was dry and warm, both at once. You wouldn't have called otherwise. Where are you? Can't say yet. I'm going to a safer location today. Safer from what exactly? Nia closed her eyes for a moment. Outside the hotel window, Seoul was fully awake now, the street below making its morning sounds. She hadn't slept, her back hurt. The baby had been active since about 4 in the morning, which the doctor said was normal, but which felt, at this particular moment, like a commentary. His organization has a problem, Nia said. The man who runs his operations has been stealing from him, and he's been engineering situations. I found the records. I have documentation. A pause, her mother processing. Does Jae-hyun know? Not yet. Does the other man know you know? Not yet, Nia. Her mother's voice dropped half a register. How long have you been sitting on this? 3 months. The silence on the other end of the call was the specific silence of a woman who had raised a daughter, who was, in her mother's words, constitutionally incapable of asking for help before she had already solved the problem. It was not an approving silence. It was also not entirely surprised. You need to be somewhere he can't use you, her mother said finally. That's where I'm going today. And Jae-hyun? Nia looked at the photograph on the desk. She had propped it against the base of the lamp at some point in the night, face out, because she found she couldn't keep putting it face down. He's going to look for me, she said. He's going to be very thorough about it. And he's going to find me eventually. I just need to be ready before he does. Ready how? Ready with everything documented. Everything organized. Every connection between Min-suk and the theft and the affair and the financial disruption laid out in a format that can't be dismissed or buried or explained away by the people who would benefit from burying it. Her mother was quiet for a moment, and after that, Nia didn't answer right away. She put her hand on her stomach. The baby moved under her palm, a slow, rolling pressure, not urgent, just present. Just there. After that, she said, I'll figure out what I actually want. She was on the KTX to Busan at 11:15, cash ticket, window seat in the quiet car. She had a bag she'd purchased at a convenience store near the Hotel Basic Supplies, a charger, 2 bottles of water. She was traveling lighter than she had ever traveled in her adult life, and found, to her own mild surprise, that it did not bother her as much as she would have predicted. She opened her laptop on the tray table and went back to the records. There were 2 remaining gaps in the documentation. The first was a set of transfer records from an account she had traced to a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. She had the account number, the approximate activity dates, and the receiving accounts on the Korean end, but she was missing the middle section, the transfer authorization chain that would connect Min-suk directly to the Cayman entity, rather than leaving it an inference. The second gap was the communication record. She had the metadata dates, durations, the device identifiers from a subsidiary server she'd accessed through her old credentials. She did not have the content. She did not need the content. The metadata, laid against her transaction timeline, was enough to establish pattern and coordination. But she wanted, if possible, one more data point. Something that placed Min-suk's decisions in proximity to specific events in Jae-hyun's personal and organizational calendar. She worked for 2 hours while the train moved south through the Korean autumn, the countryside going brown and gold outside the window, the sky low and white. She found the authorization chain at 1:45 in the afternoon, buried in a set of quarterly compliance filings from the holding company that were publicly accessible because the Cayman registry required disclosure at that level. It had been sitting there, technically visible, for 18 months. Nobody had looked, because nobody who looked at those filings was also looking at the Korean transfer records. Nobody except her. She documented it, saved it, verified it against 3 independent reference points. Chain was complete. Min-suk's connection to the Cayman entity was now not an inference. It was a documented fact. She closed the laptop and looked out the window for a while. Train was an hour from Busan. The countryside was very still. She thought about Min-suk sitting across from Jae-hyun in whatever room they were sitting in right now, his hands doing that careful thing they did, his face arranged in the expression of a concerned ally. She thought about the woman Bae Soo-jin, who had been sitting in Nia's living room the previous night with her shoes off, who was probably not a bad person, who had probably not been given a complete picture of what she was being positioned for. She thought about Jae-hyun, who was somewhere in Seoul running his network at full capacity, looking for a woman who had, with very deliberate care, given him nowhere to look. She felt for the first time since the elevator doors closed, something that was not grief and not anger, and not the cold mechanical focus of the work. She felt tired, the specific exhaustion of having held something heavy for a long time without letting anyone see her holding it. She allowed herself 4 minutes of that. She counted them. Then she sat up straight and opened her phone and sent Ji-young a message confirming her arrival time. Ji-young's cousin was a woman named Song Hai-ran, 50s, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years managing things without anyone noticing she was managing them. She met Nia at the Gijong bus stop in a small gray car and drove without asking questions to a coastal property that was exactly what Ji-young had described: small, private, set back from a road that very few people drove on in October, with a view of the sea that Nia noticed in her peripheral vision without fully absorbing, because she was on her phone, managing 3 simultaneous threads. Hai-ran showed her the key, the heating controls, the contents of the refrigerator, and the nearest hospital's address, which she had written on a piece of paper and left on the kitchen table without comment. Then she left. Nia stood in the small front room of the property and looked at the sea through the window for a moment. Then she called Ji-young. "I'm here, good." Ji-young's voice was careful. "Nia, his people have been asking around. Not in Busan yet, but in the Mapo area. Someone talked to the cab company. How much do they know? That she went to Mongwon and paid cash. That's all as of this morning. They'll get the train station CCTV eventually. Yes. Nia looked at the sea. It was the color of steel wool today, the light flat and diffuse, the water moving slowly. How long do you think I have? Ji-young was quiet for a moment. They're working through official channels? A few days. If they're working through Kang Jae-yoon's channels? A short breath. Less. I need 72 hours. I'll see what I can slow down. A pause. The financial accounts, are they secure? Completely. And the documentation? Complete as of this afternoon. Another pause. Nia, what are you going to do with it? Naya thought about the question. She had been thinking about it in some form for 3 months. The answer had changed shape as the documentation had grown more complete. What had begun as a vague protective measure, something she was building because her professional instincts told her to, had become something considerably more specific. Tool, a lever, something that could, if used correctly, accomplish several things at once. I'm going to let Jae-in find me, she said, when I'm ready. On my terms. And when he gets here, I'm going to show him exactly what his most trusted man has been doing him for the last 18 months. Ji-young breathed out slowly. And if he doesn't believe you? He'll believe me, Nia said. I have everything. She ended the call and set the phone on the windowsill and looked at the sea for a long time. She was not certain he would believe her. She was not certain of anything except the documentation, which was the only thing she had ever been fully certain of in her adult life, the records, the numbers, the patterns that did not lie because numbers did not have agendas. What she was less certain of was what came after the evidence. What happened in the space between a man understanding what he'd been set up for and a man understanding what he'd done to the woman, carrying his child. Whether those were conversations that could happen in the same room. Whether she wanted them to be. She didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. She went to the small kitchen and found a glass and filled it with water, and standing at the sink, looking out the kitchen window at a garden that had gone dormant for winter. She was hungry in a way that felt biological and slightly demanding, the particular hunger of a pregnant body that was going to insist on being fed regardless of the emotional situation. She found bread, she found eggs. She made something basic and ate it standing up, because sitting down felt like stopping, and she was not ready to stop. She was back at the laptop by 6 in the evening. At 8:47, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was 17 seconds of silence, and then, at the end, a voice she did not recognize low, measured, the Korean of someone educated and deliberate saying, in English, Mrs. Kang, I think you already know things about me. I think we should talk before your husband does something we'll all regret. Nia played it twice. She set the phone down. She looked at the sea outside the window, black now in the evening, the sound of it coming through the walls of the small house in a low continuous rhythm. Park Min-suk knew where she was, which meant he had been ahead of Jae-hyun's search the entire time, which meant he had been running a parallel operation, not helping find her, but finding her first. Which meant that everything she had assumed about her window of safety was wrong, and the 72 hours she had asked Ji-young to buy her had just collapsed to something she could not measure. She picked up the phone. She did not call Jae-hyun. She called some Singapore lawyer. I need to move the timeline up, she said when he answered. And I need to talk about what happens if the person I'm documenting reaches me before the documentation is distributed. The lawyer did not ask unnecessary questions. It was the thing she valued most about him. Tell me what you have, he said, and we'll build a dead man switch. Nia pulled the laptop closer and began. The Singapore lawyer's name was Raymond O.C., and he had spent 22 years building a practice around exactly this kind of problem, not the criminal exposure, not the organizational complexity, but the specific situation of a person who had information that powerful people wanted buried and needed to ensure that burying her would not accomplish their goal. Walk me through what you have, he said. His voice was unhurried. It was 10:40 at night in Singapore, and he sounded like a man sitting at a desk he had never fully left. Nia talked for 19 minutes without stopping. She described the transfer records, the Cayman authorization chain, the metadata pattern from the subsidiary server, the timeline correlation between Min-suk's financial movements and the disruption of Jae-hyun's organizational structure. She described the payments to Bae Soo-jin. She described the 17-second voicemail, the silence at the front of it, the English at the end of it, and what the English meant about how Min-sik wanted her to receive the message not as a threat, delivered in his native language, but as a demonstration that he understood exactly who she was and had prepared for her specifically. Raymond was quiet for a moment after she finished. She could hear him breathing. "How complete is the documentation as it currently exists?" he asked. "Complete enough that a financial crimes prosecutor could build a case from it without needing me to testify. But not distributed, no. Everything is in 4 storage locations. 3 cloud, 1 physical. All access credentials are in my memory only." "All right." A brief pause. "Here's what we're going to build. You're going to send me everything tonight, all 4 storage locations, all credentials, everything. I'm going to hold it in a sealed client file with a conditional distribution trigger. If I don't receive a confirmation call from you at a scheduled time, we'll set it for every 24 hours. The file distributes automatically to a pre-agreed recipient list. Financial crimes prosecutors, 2 investigative journalists you'll name, and the Korea Financial Intelligence Unit. What's the confirmation window if I miss a call?" 6 hours. After 6 hours with no contact, it goes. Nia looked at the window. The sea outside was invisible now, just sound and black. Min-sik had found her. She did not know how, and the not knowing was its own kind of cold. "I'll send you everything within the hour," she said. "One more thing," Raymond said. "The voicemail. He said before your husband does something we'll all regret. That's a specific framing. Telling you Jae-hyun is moving toward you, but he's also telling you he sees himself as separate from that movement. He's offering you a negotiation. I know. What are you going to do about it?" Nia thought about the voice on the voicemail. Low. Measured. English chosen deliberately, which meant he had prepared it, which meant the call had not been impulsive. A man who made impulsive calls did not choose his language that carefully. "I'm not going to call him back," she said. "That's the right call," Raymond said. "If he wanted to threaten you, he would have. The voicemail is an opening position in a negotiation he hasn't started yet. Don't give him the satisfaction of a response before you're ready." She sent him everything at 11:58. Every file, every credential, every location. She sent it over an encrypted channel Raymond had set up in the first 5 minutes of the call, the kind of channel that existed specifically because Raymond O.C. had clients who dealt with people who monitored channels. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling of the small Gijong property and thought about Min-suk's voicemail for a long time. He knew where she was. He had not told Jae-hyun, or if he had told Jae-hyun, Jae-hyun had not moved on it yet. Both options were possible. Both options were bad in different ways. If Min-suk hadn't told Jae-hyun, it meant he was running his own play with Nia as the central piece, keeping her location as private leverage, something he held that Jae-hyun didn't. If he had told Jae-hyun and Jae-hyun was on his way, the voicemail was something else, a warning or a test, or something she hadn't thought of yet. She went to bed at 1 in the morning because her body demanded it, and because a person running on 4 hours of sleep over 48 hours was not a person who made good decisions. She set an alarm for 5:30. She was asleep inside of 3 minutes. She woke up at 3:47 to the sound of a car on the road outside. She was at the window before she was fully awake, the specific alertness of a brain that had been monitoring even while the body rested. The curtain pulled back 2 inches so she could see the road without being visible from it. A single set of headlights, moving slowly. Too slowly for someone who knew where they were going, too deliberately for someone who was lost. The car stopped 20 meters down the road from the property. The headlights went off. Nia let the curtain fall. She was already thinking through the layout of the house. Front door, back door, the kitchen window that faced the garden side. She had her laptop, her phone, the encrypted drive. She had the clothes she was wearing and the coat on the chair by the door. She had the dead man's switch. That last part was the one that mattered. Whatever happened in the next 10 minutes, the documentation existed and was protected and would distribute without her doing anything further. Min-sik could walk through the front door right now, and it would change nothing about what Raymond O.C. held in Singapore. She picked up her phone. She called Ji-young. Ji-young answered in 2 rings. It was 3:47 in the morning. What happened? Someone's outside. A car stopped on the road. A sharp intake of breath. How many? I can't see, just the car. I'm calling Hi-Ran. Don't. I don't want Hi-Ran near this. Nia moved toward the back of the house, keeping her footsteps quiet on the wooden floor, the phone pressed to her ear. If it's Min-suk's people, I need to know what he offered them. If it's Jae-hoon's people, I need to know if Jae-hoon is with them. A knock at the front door. 3 times. Measured. Not urgent. Both women went silent. 3 more knocks. Same rhythm. Then a voice, in Korean. Low and clear through the door, Mrs. Kang, I'm alone. I have no weapon. I'm asking you to open the door. Nia knew the voice. She had heard it across dozens of dinners, in the background of phone calls she had not been meant to overhear, in the organizational shorthand of a man who had been near her husband for 11 years. Park Min-sik was standing on the other side of the front door of a property that no one except Ji-young and her cousin were supposed to know about. She ended the call with Ji-young. She stood in the middle of the small front room, with her phone in her hand and her coat still on the chair by the door, and she thought very specifically and clearly about what she knew versus what he knew, and who currently held more. She had the documentation. She had the dead man's switch. He had her location. She opened the door. He was alone. She looked past him at the road and the car and the surrounding dark, and there was no one else. He was wearing a dark coat, no tie, which was unusual for him. Min-sik was a man of controlled presentation. He looked like he had dressed in a hurry or in the dark, and there were shadows under his eyes that did not come from one sleepless night. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. You're alone, she said. Yes. Does Jae-hoon know where I am? Pause. You found me and didn't tell him. That's correct. She stepped back from the doorway. Not an invitation exactly, but a space in the entrance, and he took it for what it was and came inside. She closed the door behind him. She did not move further into the room. She stayed close to the door. She registered, without commenting on it. His eyes moved over the room briefly, the laptop on the table, the coat on the chair, the phone in her hand, and she watched him take inventory the way she was taking inventory. How did you find me? She said. He sat down in the chair near the window without being invited, which told her he was tired enough that he had given up on performative courtesy. Ji-young's cousin rented this property to you. Song Hai-ran has a business registration in Jeong. I've known Ji-young's professional network for 4 years. Nia looked at him. You knew about Ji-young. I know about everyone in the professional orbit of people connected to the Kang organization. That's my job. Ji-young isn't connected to the organization. She's connected to you, which connected her to me from the moment you married Jae-hoon. He rubbed one hand across his face, the gesture of a tired man, and it looked genuine in a way that his gestures at the conference table this morning had not. I've known about Han Ji-young for 2 years. I've never used it. I'm telling you this so you understand that I've been watching longer than you think, and I've been not acting on certain things for longer than you'd expect. You think that makes you look better, Nia said. No, he said. It just makes it true. She stayed where she was, near the door. Her feet were cold. She hadn't put shoes on. She was aware of that in a specific, grounding way, the cold floor, her bare feet on it. The realness of standing in a small house on the Korean coast at 3:50 in the morning, facing a man who had been systematically dismantling her husband's life, and her own along with it. You called me, she said. In English. I knew you'd play it twice. You knew wrong. I played it 3 times. Something moved in his face, not a smile. The ghost of one briefly gone before it fully arrived. Mrs. Kang, he said, and then stopped. Don't, she said. Don't use his name for me right now. Use mine. A beat. Nia. He looked at his hands, then back up at her. I came here because Jae-hoon is going to find this location within the next 12 to 18 hours, regardless of what I do. He has people working backward through the CCTV from Busan Station. They got the footage this afternoon. They confirmed it was you. They're working the Gijong connection now. He'll be here by tomorrow night, possibly earlier. She had known it was coming. It still tightened something in her chest. Why are you telling me this? Because I need to know what you have before he gets here. There it was, the clean, direct statement underneath all the careful architecture of the visit. She had been waiting for it, and it still landed with a small, specific weight. What makes you think I have anything? She said. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were she had always found Min-sik difficult to read, which was not true of most people she dealt with. Most people broadcast more than they intended. Min-sik's face was a controlled surface that occasionally, under sufficient pressure, showed something real underneath, and what she saw right now, underneath the exhaustion, and the careful framing was something that looked almost like fear. Not of her, of something she hadn't fully mapped yet. "Because you're here instead of gone," he said. "A woman who found her husband's affair and ran, she would be gone. Out of the country. Back to America. She would not be sitting in a property outside Busan with a laptop open at 3 in the morning. She's not running. She's working." He leaned forward slightly, both forearms on his knees. "You found something. The question is how much." Nia looked at him. She made a decision. "Everything," she said. He went very still. "The Cayman entity, the authorization chain, the transfer records going back 22 months, payment account for Bei Sujin, the metadata from the subsidiary server." She watched his face as she spoke, cataloging each response, the slight tightening around his eyes, at the Cayman mention, the stillness that descended at the subsidiary server, the thing that happened in his jaw at Sujin's name. "I have a complete documented picture of 18 months of systematic theft and organizational sabotage. It is currently in the hands of a Singapore-based lawyer with a conditional distribution trigger that activates if I miss a check-in." The silence after that was the longest of the night. Min-suk sat back in the chair. He put one hand over his mouth and looked at the window. Outside, the sea made its low, continuous sound. He stayed like that for almost 30 seconds, and Nia did not break the silence, because this was the kind of silence you let run, the silence of a man whose plan had just been revealed to him from the inside, by the person he had underestimated most. When he looked back at her, his face had changed. The performance was gone. What was left was rawer, and she thought, more honest than anything she had seen from him in 3 years of dinner says. "How long?" he said. 3 months. "The Cayman chain, I thought that was clean." It almost was. "You used the public disclosure filing as cover, which was smart. It was sitting in plain sight in a document nobody reads. I read it because I read everything." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but not. "Of course you did, Min-suk." She took a step toward him, not close but closer. "Why?" "That's the question I haven't been able to answer from the records alone. You've been with him 11 years. The organization gave you everything," he said quietly. "Yes, I know, then why?" He looked at her for a long moment. And she saw it happen, the calculation that had been running behind his face since he walked through the door, this assessment of what she knew, and what she didn't know, and what the gap between those two things was worth. She saw him decide. "There's something you don't have," he said. "Something that isn't in any financial record or server metadata. Something that changes the shape of everything you think you understand about this organization." Nia held very still. "Tell me, Jae-hyun knows about the Cayman account." She heard the words. She processed them. She felt the floor shift under her in a way that was not physical. "Say that again," she said. "He's known for 4 months. Not the full scope, not the authorization chain, not the theft. But he knew the account existed. He knew money was moving through it. And he didn't act on it." Min-sik held her gaze. "I know, because the person who told him was me." The room was very quiet. "You told him," Nia said slowly. "You told him that the account existed. I told him it was an operational buffer. A reserve account I was maintaining for contingency purposes. And he accepted that explanation without." Min-sik stopped. "Without the scrutiny it deserved. Because he trusted me. Because he was distracted. Or both." He looked down at his hands. "I told him 4 months ago. The same week you started looking at the records, according to my timeline. Which means you were working on this while I was actively managing his knowledge of it." Nia sat down. Not gracefully, she moved to the nearest chair and sat because her legs had made a unilateral decision. She put her hand on her stomach automatically, the gesture she made when she needed something to ground her. "He knew," she said, not to Min-suk, partly to herself. "He knew something was wrong, and he believed you. He wanted to believe me. There's a difference, is there?" Min-sik looked at her directly. "Nia, I'm telling you this because what you have the documentation, it can be used to destroy the organization completely, or it can be used to save it. That depends entirely on how it's deployed and against whom." He leaned forward again. "This goes to prosecutors before Jae-hyun has any warning. His name is on every account I touched. Not because he was involved. Because his name was on the structure, and I used that structure." He goes down with it. The cold that moved through her was not the sea air. It was the specific cold of understanding a trap from the inside. She had built documentation to expose Min-sik. She had built it carefully, completely, over 3 months. She had done everything right, and the trap she had not seen, the trap that had been there the entire time, built into the architecture before she ever started looking, was that the documentation she had built was also a trap for Jae-hyun. Min-suk had structured his theft through Jae-hyun's accounts. His name, Jae-hyun's structure. Any financial crimes investigation that started with her documentation would reach Min-suk and pass right through Jae-hyun's name on the way there. "You're not here to negotiate with me," Nia said. Her voice was very even. "You're here because the dead man's switch changes your options. If I disappear, the documentation distributes automatically. Your only move is to keep me alive and cooperative." Min-suk did not deny it. "That was part of why I came." "What's the other part?" A pause, a real one, not calculated. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 9. Her mother, we've been separated for 3 years. She lives with her mother in Daejeon." He looked at the window again. "I started this because I thought I could get out cleanly. Get enough to start over, somewhere she could come with me. Somewhere outside the organization's reach. It took longer than I planned. Got bigger than I planned. And then you—" He stopped. "And then you started looking." Nia looked at him. She did not feel sorry for him exactly. She felt the complicated, unwanted thing that happened when a person you had organized in your mind as a pure adversary showed you something human at exactly the wrong moment. "That doesn't change what you did," she said. "No," he said. "Doesn't. You used a woman, Bae Soo-jin. You used her to destabilize my marriage, and you paid her from an account you controlled, and you put her in proximity to my husband while I was pregnant." He didn't flinch. "Yes. Look at me when you say yes." He looked at her. "Yes, I did that. It was the most direct way to keep Jae-hyun's attention, internal, personal, divided. I needed him distracted from the accounts. It worked. A beat. I didn't think about what it would do to you. You didn't think about me at all." "No," he said, "I didn't." The honesty of it landed like something physical. She had been prepared for deflection, for the careful architecture of a man explaining his choices into something tolerable. She had not been prepared for this flat, exhausted truth. She stood up. Her back was aching, and her feet were still cold, and the situation she was standing in was considerably more complicated than it had been 3 hours ago. "Here's what I know," she said. "I have complete documentation. You have information that complicates how that documentation can be used. Jae-hyun will be here in less than 24 hours. And whatever happens next happens with all 3 of us in the same room, which is not a situation any of us planned for." Min-sik looked up at her. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet. I'm telling you what's true." She crossed her arms over her chest. Her stomach pressed against them, the weight and reality of it, her daughter in there, indifferent to organizational politics and financial fraud, and the logistics of leverage. "You're going to stay here tonight, not because I trust you. Because if you leave and Jae-hyun's people find you before morning, the conversation we just had disappears, and I lose the one advantage I currently have." "What advantage is that?" "I know what you told him, and you know what I have. Right now we're the only 2 people on this coast who understand the complete picture." She looked at him steadily. "You're going to sleep on that couch. You're not going to touch my laptop or my phone. And at 6 in the morning, you're going to tell me exactly what Jae-hyun believes about the Cayman account. Word for word, the conversation you had with him 4 months ago." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Once." She went to the bedroom and closed the door and stood on the other side of it with her back against the wood and her eyes closed and her hand pressed flat against her stomach. She had something she was certain of. She had held it carefully for 3 months and protected it and completed it. And tonight she had armed it with a dead man's switch that meant it could not be taken from her. And it was still in ways she hadn't seen coming. Not enough. Because Min-sik had done something she hadn't accounted for, he had built Jae-hyun into the architecture. Not as a co-conspirator, she believed that almost. She believed Jae-hyun had not known the scope, but as a structural presence, whose name was on everything Min-sik had touched, because Min-sik had made sure it was. Because a man planning to disappear always builds himself a door out, and always makes sure someone else is standing in front of it. She opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling. The sea sound came through the walls, steady and indifferent. The documentation she had built to protect herself and her daughter had become, in the last 40 minutes, the most dangerous thing in the room. because if she released it as it stood, it would take Jae-hyun down with Min-suk. And if she didn't release it, if she modified it, redrew the lines, built a version that protected Jae-hyun, she was making a choice about a man who had been in that living room with another woman's shoes off, and the champagne open and his hand 3 inches from her knee. She was making a choice about what she still wanted to be true. She pressed her back harder against the door and breathed and did not let herself cry, because crying was something she would allow herself later, specifically and privately and on her own schedule, and this was not the time. She had until Jae-hyun arrived. She needed to decide, before he got there, what version of the truth she was willing to hand him. She didn't sleep. She lay on the narrow bed in the Gejong property's single bedroom, with her coat pulled over her like a blanket, because she hadn't thought to look for extra bedding, and her feet were still cold, and the sea kept making its sound through the walls. And she stared at the ceiling and ran the calculation over and over, until it stopped feeling like a calculation and started feeling like a choice she had already made, without admitting it to herself. The documentation as it stood would take Jae-hyun down. Not because he was guilty of what Min-suk had done. She believed with the specific precision of someone who had read every financial record twice that Jae-hyun had not directed the theft. He had not structured the affair. He had not known that Bae Soo-jin was on Min-suk's payroll, or that the champagne evenings in his living room were theater staged by the man he trusted most. But his name was on the accounts. His organizational structure had been the vehicle. And in the world of financial crimes prosecution, intent was the thing you argued about at trial structure, was the thing that got you indicted. Min-sik had known this when he built it, had built it this way on purpose, had made himself so embedded in Jae-hyun's architecture that removing him would require dismantling the architecture itself. The elegant cruelty of it was something she had to acknowledge professionally, even now. She sat up at 5:45. The sky outside the window was still black, but beginning to consider gray at its edges. She put on her shoes. She splashed water on her face in the small bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, the shadows under her eyes, the particular exhaustion that lived in her face now, the way her jaw was set in a line she recognized from her mother and from herself in every hard situation she had navigated alone. She was done navigating alone. She walked out of the bedroom. Min-sik was awake on the couch. He had not slept either. She could tell he was sitting upright, with his still on, and his eyes carrying the red-edged flatness of a man who had spent the night with a problem he couldn't solve. He looked at her when she came in. Neither of them said good morning. "Tell me the conversation," she said. "Exactly, 4 months ago." "What you told him about the Cayman account," he told her. He told her in careful, sequential detail where they had been sitting, what Jae-hyun had been drinking, the words Min-sik had used to describe the account as a contingency reserve. He told her the 3 questions Jae-hyun had asked, and the answers Min-sik had given, and the moment when Jae-hyun had nodded and moved the conversation forward. Nia listened without interrupting. She was building something in her head, not a feeling, a structure. The shape of a conversation that had happened 4 months ago, in an office she had never been in, between 2 men, one of whom had been lying. He asked if the account was compliant, she said, when Min-sik finished. "Yes, and you said yes. I said it was structured for compliance." "Which is different from compliant." "Yes," and he accepted that phrasing. Min-suk looked at her. "He trusted me. He trusted you," she said. "Which means when this comes out, and it is coming out, the only question is the shape of it. His defense is that he was deceived by the person he trusted most. It's not a weak defense. That's actually a defensible position if the documentation is presented correctly." Min-suk went very still. "You're thinking about restructuring the presentation." "I'm thinking about what's true," she said. "You used his name. You used his accounts. You deceived him about the nature of the Cayman entity. All of that is documented. If the documentation is presented in the order it actually happened, your deception first. His acceptance of a false explanation, second, it reads differently than if it's presented as a shared structure. The prosecutors won't care about order. The prosecutors will care about what I tell them when I walk in with the documentation." She looked at him steadily. "I'm the one who built it. I'm the one who understands it. I'm the one who can explain the authorization chain in language that a financial crimes prosecutor can follow without a forensic accountant present for every meeting. Presentation is mine." Min-sik stood up from the couch. He was taller than she remembered, Or the room was smaller than she'd noticed, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not calculation, not performance. The specific look of a man who is realizing he has underestimated something for the last time. "You're going to protect him," he said. "I'm going to present the truth accurately," she said. "Whether that protects him depends on what he does with it." The gray at the edge of the sky was becoming something. Not sunrise yet, but the intention of it. "He'll be here in 8 hours, Min-suk said. "Maybe less." "I know. What do you want me to do?" She looked at him. This man who had sat at her dinner table and passed the side dishes and asked politely about her work and spent 11 years building himself into the architecture of the person she loved, and then spent 18 months burning it from the inside. "I want you to be in this room when he arrives," she said. "I want him to walk through that door and find both of us here. No warning. No prepared position. I want to see what he does when he sees you next to me." Min-suk's jaw tightened. "That's a risk. He might not." "I know what he might do," she said. "I know what he's capable of. I've been married to him for 3 years, and I am not, whatever you assumed about me, naive about the organization or the man who runs it." She crossed her arms. "I also know that the dead man's switch changes the calculation for everyone in this room, including him. Nobody in this situation benefits from anything happening to me. He won't know about the switch. He will the moment I tell him. And if he doesn't believe you, then the documentation goes to Raymond Osi's recipient list, and Jae-hyun spends the next 3 years in a legal situation that will cost him everything he's built." And Min-suk, she held his gaze. "You already know what happens to you." The room was very quiet except for the sea. Min-suk sat back down on the couch. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands for a moment, a gesture that was so genuinely human and so out of character with every version of him, she had known that it landed with its own particular weight. "All right," he said into his hands. Then he looked up. "All right." Jae-hyun's car came up the road at 2:17 in the afternoon. Nia heard it before she saw it, the sound of tires on the coastal road, moving with the specific purposefulness of a vehicle that knows its destination. She was at the kitchen table with her laptop open, and she closed it slowly and set both hands flat on the table and breathed. Across the room, Min-suk straightened in his chair. His face had gone back to its controlled surface. She could see, underneath it, the fear real and physical, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind. Good. Fear was honest. Fear she could work with. The car stopped. A door. Then a second door, 2 people, then. Jae-hyun had brought someone. She had expected that, footsteps on the path. Pause at the front door. He had seen Min-suk's car, which was still on the road outside, and she knew that pause was him, registering it, cataloging it, reorganizing his understanding of what he was walking into. Then the knock. 3 times hard, not Min-suk's measured knock. This was the knock of a man who did not actually need to knock, but was maintaining the form of it by will. Nia stood up. She walked to the door. She opened it. Jae-hyun looked at her. She had been thinking, for the past 8 hours, about what it would feel like to see his face. She had been bracing for something, anger or relief, or the specific combination of both that comes when you find someone after a long search. She had been bracing for the version of him that ran an organization, the controlled surface, the assessment. What she had not braced for was how tired he looked. He was wearing the same coat from yesterday, she could tell, because the left collar was slightly folded in, where it had been against a car seat. He hadn't shaved. His eyes were on her face with an intensity that was not the organizational kind, not the evaluative kind, but something rawer than either of those things. And for exactly 1 second before he reassembled himself, she saw it, the fear. Not Min-suk's fear, something different. The fear of a man who had spent 36 hours imagining possibilities and had not liked most of them. Behind him, one of his men, she recognized him. Oh Sung-woo from building security stood at a careful distance. "You're not hurt," Jae-hyun said. His voice was even, but the evenness was worked for. "No," she said. His eyes moved past her. Found Min-suk. Everything in his face went still. Not the controlled stillness she knew. A different kind. The stillness of a system encountering information that doesn't fit the model and going briefly offline while it recalibrates. Sung-woo said, without looking away from Min-suk. "Wait by the car." Sung-woo left without a word. Nia stepped back from the doorway. Jaehyun came inside. He stood in the middle of the small front room and looked at Min-sik, and the look between them was the kind that contained 11 years, and whatever 11 years of trust looks like when it starts to crack from the inside. Min-sik did not look away. He held the look with the stillness of a man who had made his decision about how this meeting was going to go. "Why is he here?" Jaehyun said. Still even. Still worked. "Because I asked him to be," Nia said. She moved to the kitchen table. She opened her laptop. "Sit down, Jaehyun." He looked at her. The look had shifted. The fear was gone now, or buried. And what was present was the version of him she had seen, across conference tables, in other people's stories. The man who ran things, the man who did not take direction from anyone. "Nia, sit down," not loud, not performed. Just the voice she used when she meant it and was not interested in argument. He sat down. In the chair by the window, the same chair Min-sik had used the night before. He put both hands on his knees and looked at her, and said nothing. She turned the laptop to face him. "This is 18 months of your most trusted lieutenant's financial activity," she said. "I'm going to walk you through it. I need you to not say anything until I'm done. Can you do that?" Jaehyun looked at the screen, then at Min-sik, then back at the screen. "How long have you had this?" he said. 3 months. I said, "Don't say anything until I'm done." Jaw tightened. He looked at the screen. She walked him through it. 22 minutes, start to finish, the transfer records, the Cayman authorization chain, the timeline, the payment account. She talked the way she talked to clients who needed to understand something complex without getting lost in it. Clear, sequential, no editorial. She let the numbers carry the weight. They were good at it. Numbers didn't need her to perform conviction. They just needed to be read correctly. She did not look at Min-suk while she talked. She watched Jaehyun. She watched the thing that happened in his face as the picture assembled itself. It was not fast. It built slowly, the way understanding builds, when the thing being understood is something you don't want to understand. The first piece landing with a question, the second with a qualification, third with something that could still be alternate explanation, and then the fourth piece, the one that closed the exits, arriving and sitting there undeniable. She had been at this table with people in this moment before. The moment when the documentation stopped being a document and became real. It always looked the same. The breath changed. The hands changed. Some people gripped. Some people went flat and still. Jaehyun went still, both hands on his knees perfectly still, and the breath came in slightly shorter than it had been. When she finished, the room was quiet. "The Cayman account," Jaehyun said. His voice was different now. The evenness was gone, and what was underneath it was not anger. "Not yet," he told me. "I know what he told you," Nia said. "He told you it was a contingency reserve. He told me this morning specifically what he said to you and how he set it." She looked at him. "He lied to you. Your name is on the account structure because he built it through your accounts. That was deliberate. You were going to be the structure he pointed at when he was ready to leave." Jaehyun looked at Min-suk, and Min-suk looked back at him. And the thing that passed between them in that look was the thing that Nia had no documentation for. The thing that existed only in the space between two people who had trusted each other for 11 years and were now sitting on opposite sides of a table with 18 months of lies between them. "Say it," Jaehyun said. His voice had dropped half a register. Not loud, the opposite of loud. The kind of voice that was quieter than a normal voice. The way a held breath is quieter than breathing. Min-suk held the look. Most of it is accurate, most. The Cayman account, the transfers. Yes, a pause. The Sujin arrangement. Yes, Jaehyun's hands on his knees contracted. One motion, brief, controlled immediately. You arranged it. Yes, you arranged for that woman. He stopped. Controlled the sentence. You arranged it while Nia was, yes, Min-suk said. The words sat in the room. Jaehyun stood up. He moved toward Min-suk and Nia said, Jaehyun, in a voice that was not loud either, and he stopped. He was 3 feet from Min-suk. His breathing was audible now, through his nose, measured and deliberate in the way of a man keeping himself on a leash he was not certain he trusted. Why, he said. I needed you distracted, Min-suk said. Personal instability, a man managing problems at home, manages the office differently. I needed your attention divided. You used my wife. I used a situation. She was 8 months pregnant. I know. The words came out flat and small from Min-suk's mouth, and they were the worst possible words he could have said because they were honest and insufficient simultaneously, and Jae-hyun's face did something with them that Nia watched happen and could not fully catalog because she had never seen him look exactly like that before. He turned away from Min-suk. He turned away and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room, both hands at his sides, looking at the sea. Nobody spoke. The sea made its sound. The gray afternoon light came through the glass and hit the side of his face, and he stood very still and breathed. Nia let it run for 30 seconds. Then she said, "There's something else." Turn back. His face was reassembled, but the reassembly was imperfect. Something was showing through at the edges that she hadn't seen from him before. "The documentation as it stands implicates you," she said. "Not as a co-conspirator, but the account structure has your name on it, and the transfers ran through your organization. If this goes to prosecutors as it currently exists, you are indicted on the same filing as Min-suk. It's not an opinion. That's what the documents say." Jae-hyun looked at her. "You've had this for 3 months." "Yes, and you didn't." He stopped. She could see him working through it. "You built a dead man's switch, Raymond Osi, in Singapore. 24-hour check-in. If I miss, it distributes to prosecutors, 2 journalists, and the Korea Financial Intelligence Unit." Something moved in his face. "When did you set that up?" "Last night. Before or after you knew Min-suk was here?" "After. But I would have done it either way." He looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that she felt the weight of it, the specific weight of being looked at by someone who is trying to understand you and finding the picture larger than they expected. "You've been planning this for 3 months, he said. While I was going to appointments alone because you were busy, she said, and she kept her voice flat because she could not afford for it to be anything else right now. While I was figuring out what I was carrying, which was not just our daughter. While I was watching patterns in the financial records that I initially looked at because something felt wrong and turned into something considerably larger than wrong." She held his gaze. "I wasn't planning an exit, Jae-hyun. I was building a safety net because I am a woman who knows enough about your world to understand that safety nets are not optional." He looked at her. His throat moved. "I saw you in the elevator," he said. "Your face. I know, He stopped again. The sentence wasn't going where he wanted it to go. She could see that she let it fail. "I should have." "Yes," she said, "you should have." The simplicity of her agreement seemed to land harder than an argument would have. He looked briefly like a man who had been preparing for a fight and found instead that his opponent had simply agreed with him, which was worse. Min-suk said from the couch, Jae-hyun. His voice was low. "There are people I didn't tell you about, beyond the Cayman account. People who knew what I was doing and helped cover it. 3 of them are still in the organization." Jae-hyun's eyes moved to him. "Cold names. I'll give you names, all of them. Everything the full scope, not just what Nia documented." He paused. "In exchange for—" "You don't get to negotiate," Jae-hyun said. "I have a daughter. So does she." The words came out with a quiet, final weight. "You thought about yours. Did you think about hers?" Min-suk looked at his hands. "Names," Jae-hyun said again. "Now you give me everything, and you give it completely. And in return, the manner of what comes next is less specific than it could be. That's what you get." Min-suk looked up. He held Jae-hyun's gaze for a moment, and whatever he saw in it, the calculation completed itself. He nodded. Once. He talked for 40 minutes. Nia recorded it on her phone. She had set it recording when Jae-hyun knocked, quietly, screen down on the table. She was a woman who recorded things. It was a professional habit. She had stopped apologizing for years ago. Min-suk gave them 3 names inside the organization. He gave them the details of a parallel communication channel he had been running through a subsidiary office in Incheon that Jae-hyun had never known existed. He gave them the full scope of the Cayman transfers, not just what Nia had documented, but the complete figure, which was 40% higher than her estimate and landed in the room with a silence that had weight. He gave them the contact name of the person who had connected him to the Cayman entity, originally not a name inside the organization. Someone outside it. Someone connected to a competing structure that had been, Nia understood as Min-suk spoke, using Min-suk's operation as a long-term strategy to weaken the Kang organization from the inside before making a move. She had not had that piece. She had not known there was a piece she was missing. She looked at Jae-hyun as Min-suk said the name. Jae-hyun went very still. "You know that name," she said. "Yes," he said. "Who is it?" He looked at her. Someone who has been waiting for an opening in my organization for 4 years. His jaw was set. Someone I considered an ally. The room shifted. The shape of the whole situation shifted with it, not just an internal betrayal, not just a trusted lieutenant stealing and manufacturing instability, but an external operation. Coordinated play by someone with resources and patience, and a 4-year timeline, using Min-suk as the instrument. How close are they, Nia said. How close to having what they need? They were waiting for me to be indicted, Jae-hyun said. Or for the organization to fracture internally enough that a takeover was viable. He looked at Min-sek. You were supposed to be the trigger. Min-suk said nothing. When were you going to move, Jae-hyun said. 3 more months, Min-suk said. I was going to complete the transfers and leave. The external contact was going to handle the rest. With my name on the accounts. Yes, the single syllable sat there, and nobody added anything to it. Jae-hyun turned to Nia. He looked at her with the specific look of a man who has just understood the full scope of something and is trying to determine whether the ground he's standing on is solid. The dead man's switch, he said. If the documentation goes out. It goes to prosecutors first, she said. Your name is on the filing. Before you can build any defensive position, before you can demonstrate the deception. You get indicted on the same filing as Min-sik, and the external contact has exactly what they need your organization in legal freefall. Unless the documentation is restructured. Unless the documentation is restructured, she confirmed. Presented in a way that establishes the deception first. Your name in its correct place, the structure that was used without your knowledge, the explanation you were given, the lie. She paused. Possible. The documentation supports it, but it requires me to rebuild the presentation, to sequence it correctly, to make the deception the headline instead of the account structure. He looked at her. She looked at him. And you need me to trust you to do that, he said. Yes, she said. After everything, yes. The word was small and enormous simultaneously, and she held it there and did not add anything to it, because there was nothing to add. It was the whole truth of the moment. She was asking him to trust her. She was asking him, with 3 months of secret work on the table between them, with a dead man's switch armed in Singapore, with his most trusted lieutenant sitting 3 feet away, having just confessed to 18 months of systematic betrayal, and with their daughter 8 months along, a girl, with his brow and her nose, according to the doctor, pressing against the inside of Nia's ribs with that slow rolling, entirely indifferent insistence. Jae-hyun looked at her for a long time. The sea kept its sound. The gray light held. He said, "Tell me what you need." And then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. The color in his face changed not much, barely visible, but she was watching, and she saw it. "The Inchin subsidiary," he said. "The one Min-sek just told us about." He showed her the screen. An unfamiliar number, a Inchin area code. "They know we're here," Min-suk said from the couch, his voice gone flat. "The external contact has been monitoring my locations." "How long have you been here?" Jae-hyun said. "Since 3:40 this morning." 11 hours. Jae-hyun looked at Nia. His voice dropped to something barely above a breath. "If they've had 11 hours to identify this locations." Outside on the coastal road, a second car had appeared. The second car sat on the coastal road without moving. Jae-hyun was at the window in 4 steps, his body between the glass and Nia, before she had processed the movement, and she understood in that instant, without sentiment, just factually, that whatever else was true about him, the instinct was real. The instinct to put himself between her and the thing outside was not calculated. It was older than calculation. "How many?" he said, to Min-sek, without turning from the window. Min-sek was on his feet. He had moved to the wall beside the window, the wall that gave him an angle on the road without being visible from it. His face had the color of someone who understood precisely what his cooperation had just cost him in terms of safety. If the external contact sent people, not many, 2, maybe 3. They wouldn't send a team. This property is exposed. Team draws attention. Then why send anyone at all, Jae-hyun said. To confirm location, to assess. Min-sek's jaw was tight. Possibly to take something that would make the documentation unusable. Both men looked at Nia. She was already at the kitchen table. She had the phone still recording, and the laptop and the encrypted drive, and she was making a calculation that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with logistics. "Raymond Osei," she said. "If I call him right now and tell him to trigger early distributions." Don't, Jaehyun said. If we lose the documentations. We're not losing anything. He looked at Sung-woo, who had appeared in the doorway. He must have come in through the back, which meant Jaehyun had given him a signal she hadn't seen. Sung-woo, the car on the road. 2 people inside, Sung-woo said. Engine off. They've been there 9 minutes. They're waiting, Min-sik said. Confirmation call. Someone told them to hold until they got a confirmation. Confirmation of what? Nia said. That the documentation exists here physically. Min-sik looked at her. The encrypted drive. If they know you have a physical copy, they want it. Digital files can be revoked, resecured, explained away. A physical drive that disappears, that's cleaner. Jaehyun turned from the window. He looked at Nia with an expression she could read clearly, not a question, a statement. He was telling her something with his eyes that he was not going to say, out loud, with Min-sik in the room. She understood it. She nodded once. She ejected the encrypted drive from her laptop. Closed the laptop. She looked around the small kitchen, opened the cabinet under the sink, found a plastic bag with cleaning supplies, and pressed the drive into the bag against the back wall of the cabinet behind a bottle of bleach. Jaehyun watched her do it without a word. Then he said, Sung-woo, I need you to take Mrs. Kang out the back of this property. There's a garden, then a slope down to the beach path. Stay on the beach until you reach the next property. North, it's about 400 meters. Wait there. I'm not leaving, Nia said. Nia, I'm not leaving. She stood up from the cabinet. The documentation is mine. The dead man's switch is mine. Those people outside decide to move and something happens to you. She stopped. She reframed. If the situation escalates without me present, I lose control of the one thing keeping all of this from collapsing. Raymond Sosi needs to hear my voice on the check-in call-in. She looked at her phone. 6 hours. I stay. Jaehyun looked at her. A muscle in his jaw worked once. The back of the property, he said. The garden, not the beach. Close enough that Sung-woo can reach you in 30 seconds if he needs to, far enough that you're not in this room. She looked at him. Please, he said. Quiet. The word cost him something. She could hear it in the way he said. The slight roughness of a man who didn't say that word in this register often. She picked up her phone and her coat and walked to the back door. The garden was dead for winter. Brown stalks and collapsed plants in the beds along the low stone wall, the ground hard underfoot, the sea below and to the right, making its continuous gray sound. Sung-woo stood 3 feet behind her and slightly to her left, which was the correct position for someone managing personal security, close enough, not intrusive, not visible to anyone watching from the roadside of the property. She stood with her coat pulled closed and her hand on her stomach, and she listened. She could hear through the wall of the property the sound of voices. Not words, registers. Jaehyun's voice and Min-suk's, and then a third voice, someone from outside, someone who had come to the door, which meant the waiting had ended, and the next phase had begun. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ji-young. I know where you are. Are you safe? She typed back, for now. Stand by. She put the phone in her coat pocket and kept her hand there, curled around it, and waited. The conversation inside went on for 6 minutes. She counted them in the specific way she had learned, to count things under pressure, not watching the clock, but feeling the time in her breath, her heartbeat, the weight of the sky overhead. 6 minutes was not a short conversation for a confrontation. Minutes meant words were being used. Words meant the situation had not gone physical. Then a door, the front door, from the sound of it and footsteps on the path outside. One set, moving away, then quiet. The back door of the property opened, and Jaehyun came out into the garden. He looked at her. He looked at Sung-woo, who moved back another few feet without being asked. One person, Jaehyun said, from the external contact side. He wanted to know if the documentation exists and where it's stored. He paused. I told him it was in Singapore, digitally, no physical copy. Did he believe you? I don't know. It doesn't matter whether he believed me. What matters is what he reports back and what they decide to do with it. He looked at the sea below them. The contact's name that Min-suk gave us, he's been moving against me for 4 years. He's not going to expose himself over a single property visit. He's going to recalculate. How long does that give us? Enough. He looked back at her, to do what needs to be done. She looked at him. The afternoon was going the color of tarnished silver. His face in that light looked older than she usually thought of him as looking, Or maybe she was seeing something she had been too close to see clearly before the weight of the organization. Specific exhaustion of being the person that everything runs through. The thing that had been there behind his eyes for months that she had been misreading as distance. "What happened to Min Suk?" she said, a brief pause. "Still inside. Sungwoo's people are with him." He looked at his hands, then back up at her. "He's going to give a full statement. Everything, the theft, the arrangement with Sujin, external contact, the 3 names inside the organization. All of it. I'm going to have it documented through a legal channel that's separate from yours. 2 documentation streams," she said, "his statement and my records. When they're combined and presented correctly, the prosecution case against Min Sik and the external contact is." He stopped. Looked at her. "It's yours. The whole shape of it is something you built." He stopped again. "You just showed up," she said. "I showed up late." "Yes," she said. "You did." The word sat between them. Not cruel, not a wound, exactly. Just true, the way things are true when you've stopped managing them. He took a step toward her. He stopped himself. She saw him stop himself, the physical restraint of a man who had learned through many years of organizational life that you don't move toward something before you know if it's going to move toward you. "I need to say something," he said. "You don't have to." "I need to say it." She waited. He stopped. Started again. "What I allowed to happen. I'm not going to tell you I didn't know what I was doing. I knew. I made a choice, and I made it badly, and I made it while you were—" His voice changed on the last word, went rougher than the rest of the sentence, and he controlled it. "I made it while you were carrying our daughter, and that is the part I can't." He stopped. Looked at the sea. "There's no version of that I can explain." She said nothing. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I'm not asking you to." He looked at her directly. "I don't know what I'm asking. I just needed you to know I understand what I did." She looked at him for a long moment. The sea kept going. Her daughter moved inside her, that slow, rolling presence, indifferent to the conversation happening outside her, entirely occupied with the business of becoming. "I know you understand it," Nia said. "Understanding it isn't the same as having paid for it." "No," he said, "it's not. That part takes longer." "I know. And I don't know yet what I'm going to decide. About us. About what this—" She pressed her lips together. "I'm not making any decisions about our marriage while I'm standing in a dead garden on the Korean coast, 8 months pregnant with people from a rival organization sitting in a car on the road outside. I'm not capable of that right now, and I wouldn't trust myself if I were." Something in his face shifted. It was not relief, it was something more complicated than relief. Something that acknowledged the weight of what she had just said without trying to minimize it. "All right," he said. "What I need right now is to finish this." The documentation restructured. Min Suk's statement documented. The 3 names inside the organization handled. The external contact's exposure timed correctly so he can't position himself first. She looked at Jae-hyun. "That's what I need. Can you work with me on that?" He held her gaze. "Then let's go inside." They worked for 7 hours. It was not clean work, and it was not simple work, and there were 3 points during those 7 hours. When the 2 of them came close to a different kind of fight, not about the documentation, but about decisions, about sequence, about the correct legal channel for Min Sik's statement, about what the external contact's exposure timeline should look like and who should control it. Jae-hyun was not a man who took direction easily. She already knew this. She had known it for 3 years. What she had not fully calibrated before was how it manifested when the direction was coming from her, and the subject was his organization, the specific resistance of a man who had spent his adult life being the person in the room who understood. The most, now sitting across from someone who understood something. He had missed entirely and needed to accept that gap before they could move forward. Accepted it. Not quickly. Not without friction. Accepted it. The restructured documentation took 4 hours. She rebuilt the presentation sequence from the foundation, the deception first, the account structure second. Jae-hyun's name in its correct context with the explanation he had been given, and the date he had been given it, and the words Min Suk had used, which were now recorded in the audio from the morning conversation she had captured on her phone. That recording was the piece that made the restructured presentation not just an argument, but a demonstrable fact. Min Suk's own voice, in Min Suk's own words, describing the lie he had told. She sent the restructured documentation to Raymond Osi at 9:47 in the evening, replacing the original files. She called him at 9:48. He confirmed receipt, confirmed the check-in. He read back the recipient list, and she told him to add a fourth name, a Korea Financial Intelligence Unit contact that Jae-hyun had provided, a person who owed Jae-hyun no favors, but who was known for clean, complete prosecution work. The original files are superseded, she told Raymond. The new version is the complete and accurate record. Confirmed, Raymond said. Check-in is set for 2200 tomorrow. Don't miss it. She ended the call. Min-sik's statement took another 2 hours. He gave it into a recording that Jae-hyun legal counsel reached by phone in Seoul, who drove through the night and arrived at the Gijong property at 11:30, witnessed and verified. It was comprehensive. It was specific. It named names and amounts and dates and the full mechanics of the external contact's involvement, the 4-year timeline of the strategy to weaken the Kang organization from within. When it was done, Min-sik sat in the chair by the window, looking like a man who had set down something very heavy and was not certain what his arms were for without the weight. Jae-hyun's legal counsel took the recording and the witness documentation and drove back to Seoul at 1 in the morning. Sung-woo handled the 3 names inside the organization over the phone in a series of calls that Nia did not listen to and did not need to, because what happened to those 3 people was not her documentation and not her decision, and she had enough to manage. At 1:15 in the morning, Jae-hyun came into the kitchen where Nia was sitting with a cup of tea she had found in the cabinet and made because her hands needed something to do, and he sat down across from her at the small table. They sat there for a moment without speaking. The external contact, she said. He'll receive a package tomorrow morning, Jae-hyun said. The full documentation of his 4-year operation against my organization, combined with Min-suk's statement naming him directly, delivered simultaneously to his own legal counsel and to the KFIU contact. He looked at his hands on the table. He'll know, when he receives it, that moving against me now would be the worst possible moment. His exposure is documented and held. Moving confirms guilt. So he backs down, or he exposes himself completely. A pause. Men like him back down. They're patient. They wait for a better opening. He looked at her. There won't be one. Because you'll be watching. Because I know what to watch for now. He said it without pride, which was the right way to say it. She looked at her tea. Bae Sujin, she said, the woman. Jae-hyun was quiet for a moment. I ended it 3 weeks ago. Before he stopped, she looked at him. Before I knew any of this about Min-suk, he said. I ended it because I understood what I was doing to you, and I couldn't. He stopped again. I couldn't continue something that I knew was wrong. Which doesn't make it less wrong that it happened, she said. No, he said. It doesn't. She was being paid by Min-suk. She may not have known the full context of why. I know. I'm not. He looked up. I'm not angry at her. That's the right answer, Nia said. Warmly. Just accurately. He accepted that too. Song Hai-ran came back in the morning, with groceries she had apparently decided, with the particular practical wisdom of a woman, who understood that crises did not suspend the body's requirements, were more immediately useful than any other available form of help. She set them on the counter and looked at the state of the small property, the multiple coats on chairs, the evidence of a night that had involved more people than the space was designed for, the specific atmosphere of a room that had been used for something consequential, and she said nothing about any of it and made breakfast. Naya ate it standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down still felt like stopping. Jae-hyun sat at the table. He ate everything on the plate Hai-ran set in front of him, with the focused efficiency of a man fueling a machine, and he watched Naya across the kitchen with the specific quality of watching that she had noticed in him in the earliest days of their acquaintance, not surveillance, not possession. Something more like the way a person watches, something they are trying to memorize. Min-sik left at 9 in the morning, with 2 of Sung-woo's people, for a meeting with the legal counsels in Seoul that would begin the formal process of his cooperation agreement. He paused at the door. He looked at Nia. The daughter, he said. It wasn't a question. He meant her daughter, the child. She's fine, Nia said. He looked at her for a moment with the exhausted, cleared-out look of a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and had set it down and was not yet sure who he was without it. Then he nodded. He left the door closed. The small property was quieter than it had been in 30 hours. Jae-hyun looked at Nia across the kitchen. She looked back at him. Hai-ran was washing dishes at the sink with the considered obliviousness of a woman who understood her role in this moment, which was to be present without being present. I want to take you home, Jae-hoon said. I know. Not to the penthouse, he paused. Wherever you want. He stopped himself from finishing the sentence the way he usually finished sentences, which was with a decision. He left it open, deliberately. She saw the effort that cost him, and she filed it. I need another day here, she said, to confirm with Raymond, to make sure the timing on the external contacts package is correct. She looked at him. You can stay, or you can go back to Seoul and start handling what needs to be handled there. He looked at her for a moment. I'll stay. It was the right answer. She didn't tell him it was the right answer. He didn't need to be told. They walked on the beach that afternoon. Not together, exactly. They were walking in the same direction, at the same pace, with a foot of air between them, which was its own kind of together. The sea was gray-green, and the wind was coming off it with the smell of salt and cold and the particular cleanness as of a coast in autumn. She did not hold his hand. He did not offer it. They walked for 40 minutes. They said almost nothing. She stopped once to look at something in the water, a fishing boat, far out, moving slowly south, and he stopped when she stopped and waited. There was a version of this walk, she understood, that would happen in a movie, the speech, confession, the moment where the right words assembled themselves, and the music came up, and the complicated thing became simple. She had known, since she was old enough to understand the difference between movies and life, that the right words rarely assembled themselves in real time, and that the complicated thing did not become simple just because you wanted it to. The complicated thing became manageable. That was the actual achievement. That was what you worked toward. I need you to understand something, she said. They had stopped near the water's edge. The foam came up to within a foot of her shoes. He was listening. I stayed because of what I found, she said. The documentation, Minsik, the external contact. I stayed because it was the right tactical decision, and because running would have put our daughter in a more complicated position than staying. I did not stay because I forgave you. I know, he said. I'm going to go home because it's the right next step. Because the penthouse is where my things are, and where the next 8 weeks of appointments need to happen, and where this, she put her hand on her stomach, is going to arrive, and she is going to arrive in a place that is as stable as I can make it. I know, he said again. And we are going to have an entirely separate conversation when all of this is settled and she is here, and I have slept for more than 4 consecutive hours about what our marriage looks like going forward. And in that conversation, I am going to tell you exactly what I need, and you are going to actually listen to it, which means not solving it before I finish talking. He was quiet for a moment. Then I'm bad at that. I know you are, she said. Work on it. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. The beginning of one that decided, at the last moment, not to fully arrive. She recognized it. She had filed it once as something guarded. She understood it now as something different, a man containing himself, because the alternative was too much in both directions. I'll work on it, he said. She looked at the water. You should know, she said, that I'm keeping the accounts under my maiden name. I'm keeping my independent financial structure. I'm keeping Raymond Ossie's number, and I am going to call him if I ever need to. That's not a threat. I know, he said. It's a boundary. She looked at him. I looked up the word, he said. What it actually means. Not what I always assumed it meant. A pause. Took me until last night. She looked at the water for another moment. Then she turned back toward the property. He walked beside her, the same foot of air, the same pace. The photograph, she said, when they were nearly back. Ultrasound. I had it in my coat pocket the night I left. He was quiet. I didn't leave it, she said. I thought about it. Didn't. He said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, thank you. She did not answer that. There was nothing to answer. She had not kept the photograph for him. She had kept it because it was hers, because her daughter was hers, because the image of that small human being had nothing to do with the mess of adult decisions surrounding her arrival and had everything to do with the fact of her. But she let him have the thank you anyway. Some things you let people have. 3 weeks later, in the Gangnam penthouse, the legal counsel confirmed that the Korea Financial Intelligence Unit had opened a formal investigation into the External Contacts Organization based on the combined documentation and Min-suk's cooperation agreement. The external contact had declined to respond publicly and had, according to sources Jae-hyun did not name to Nia, begun quietly withdrawing his operational presence from Seoul. Min-sik's cooperation agreement included full restitution, a figure that was paid from the Cayman account's remaining balance in a transaction that Raymond Ose's office verified and documented. The 3 names inside the organization were gone from it by the end of the first week. The ancient subsidiary office was closed. The penthouse felt different in those 3 weeks. Not resolved was not the right word. Nia did not believe in resolution as a discrete event. She believed in things being worked on. The penthouse was being worked on. There were conversations that happened over dinner, sometimes, that did not finish themselves neatly and did not try to. There were silences that she was learning, again, to read which ones meant the door shutting and which ones meant the person thinking, and the difference was clearer now than it had been before, or he was making it clearer, or both. He had removed the people who had known about the affair. All of them, without being asked a second time. He had not asked her to forgive him again. He had, on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Gijong, made her coffee the way he always had, the specific way, the one she hadn't told him she appreciated. The one he had learned and maintained and never made a production of, and set it on the counter and walked out of the kitchen without comment. She had picked it up. She had stood at the counter and held it and looked at the window. She had thought about her mother, who had said men like that love specific, and when they decide something is theirs, they don't let it go, and the 2 warnings that lived inside that sentence. She understood them both now. What they cost, what they were worth sometimes, if the man in question understood the difference between holding on and holding down. Jae-hyun was learning that difference. She was watching him learn it. It was not a quick study, and it was not without wrong steps, and on the days when he got it wrong, she told him. And he listened, with the specific quality of listening she had asked him for on the beach, without solving it before she finished. He was bad at it. He was working on it. It was enough for now. It was enough to keep going. Her daughter arrived on a night in November, when the rain was back against the penthouse was in that specific Seoul, way persistent, gray, the city doing its nighttime business behind the glass. Jae-hyun was beside her in the way that mattered, not performing it, not managing it, just there. His hand when she needed it to grip, and his silence when she needed the room to contain nothing, except for getting through the next moment. The doctor said her name first. Nia looked at her daughter, and her daughter looked with the unfocused and total attention of the newly arrived at the light. Small, she was real. She was entirely herself already, in the way that new people always were complete, somehow, before the world had a chance to complicate them. Jae-hyun looked at the child and then at Nia, and his face did the thing she had imagined in the car. On the way to the appointment that had started everything, the control slipping. For one moment, the man underneath the organization briefly visible. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they almost lost before they understood what they had. She let him look. She was not ready to give him everything back. She was not certain she ever would be, in the specific form that things had been before. She was here, and he was here, and the child between them was real and warm and already, with the blind competence of the newborn, demanding that the adults in the room get themselves together. Nia looked down at her daughter. She had been protecting this child since the elevator. Since before the elevator, since the first appointment she had attended alone, since the first record she had pulled, and the first pattern she had noticed, and the first quiet decision to know where she stood regardless of what else was true. She had protected her. She was still protecting her. That part would not change. What might change, what she was willing to let change, slowly, on terms she controlled, was what happened around the protection. The life she was willing to build, the person she was willing to let back into the architecture of it, on the condition that he understood the architecture was hers. She looked at Jae-hyun. "She has your brow," she said. He looked at the child, then at her. The doctor said. "I know what the doctor said." She shifted the weight in her arms, the extraordinary new weight. "She still has your brow." He looked at the child for a long moment. Something in his face settled not into happiness exactly, which was too simple, but into something that sat below happiness and was more durable. Kind of feeling that doesn't need a word, because words would make it smaller. "What are we going to call her?" he said. Nia had thought about this for weeks. She had a list, at one point names from both their backgrounds, names that bridged, names that were neither one thing nor the other, but stood on their own. She had discarded all of them one by one, for reasons she couldn't always articulate, until she was left with one, which had arrived not as a decision but as a recognition. "Mara," she said. He said it once quietly to hear what it sounded like. Then he nodded. The rain kept going outside, Seoul kept going. The city indifferent to the specific and enormous fact of one new person entering it. Naya held her daughter, and her daughter breathed, and the room was, for the first time in a long time, just a room, not a negotiation, not a battlefield, not the site of a careful and exhausting attempt to stay ahead of the next thing. Just a room with two people who had made a serious mess of the space between them, and a third person who had arrived into that space, and who did not yet know about messes, who knew only the immediate and total needs of the newly born: warmth, presence, the sound of a familiar voice. Nia spoke to her in a low voice, not words exactly, more like the shape of words. Her daughter turned her head toward the sound, with the slow, searching movement of something that does not yet have a word for comfort, but knows where it lives. She knew where it lived. That was enough. That was, Nia thought, always the thing that was enough, not the clean resolution, not the enemies neutralized and the paperwork filed, and the man transformed into someone uncomplicated. The transformation was real, and the neutralization was real, and the paperwork had been filed in Singapore since Seoul, and with 2 international journalists who would sit on it indefinitely. All of that was real. But the thing that was enough was this. She had walked into an elevator, and she had made a decision, and she had protected the person who needed protecting, and that person was now here, was now warm, was now turning her small and perfect face toward the sound of her mother's voice. Nia Carter, not Kang Nia, not the consultant's wife, not the pregnant woman who disappeared before dawn. Nia Carter had done what she came to do. She stayed. Not because she was forgiven, or because she had been saved, or because the feared man in the corner of the room had chosen correctly, and that made everything right. She stayed because she decided to, on her own terms, with her own accounts, and her own documentation, and her own lawyer's number in her phone, and her own name on the 3 accounts that nobody except her could access. She stayed because the choice was hers. That was the only reason that counted. Mara slept. She slept with the absolute commitment of someone who had just completed the most significant physical undertaking of her brief existence, her face slack and perfect, her small chest rising and falling in the rhythm that Nia could not stop watching, not anxiously, not anymore, but with the specific attention of someone who had been waiting for this particular sight for a long time and was now finally allowed to simply look at it. Jae-hyun had moved his chair closer to the bed at some point in the last hour. Not close enough to crowd, close enough that if Nia needed something, she would not have to ask twice. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the child, and he had been quiet for so long that the quiet had stopped feeling like the guarded kind and started feeling like the thinking kind, which was the distinction she had asked him to make visible, and which he was, imperfectly, and with obvious effort, trying to make visible. She watched him watch their daughter. She thought about the man she had seen in the elevator doorway, the recalculation on his face, the sentence that hadn't finished, forming before the doors closed. She thought about all the distance between that moment and this one. Not distance in the sentimental sense, not the journey metaphor she had always found too convenient. Actual distance. Measured in decisions made under pressure, in records built in hotel rooms, in a dead garden on the Korean coast, in 40 minutes of walking on a gray beach with a foot of air between them that neither of them had closed. Distance was real. It did not disappear because a child had arrived into the room. But it was, she thought, traversable. That was the word she kept coming back to. Not closed, not gone. Traversal, a space that could be moved through, carefully, by people who understood what they were moving through and why it was necessary to move carefully. She's going to know everything, Nia said. Not loud. The room was for quiet voices now. Jae-hyun looked up. When she's old enough, Nia said, I'm not going to raise her on a curated version of what her parents are. I'm not going to teach her that the way you maintain a life is by managing what other people know about it. She looked at Mara. She's going to know that her mother kept records. She's going to know that her mother had her own accounts and her own lawyer and her own plan that didn't depend on anyone else executing it correctly. And she's going to know that these are not symptoms of a broken marriage. They are symptoms of a woman who understood her own situation clearly. Jae-hyun was quiet for a moment. And me, he said. What is she going to know about me? Naya considered the question the way she considered things that deserved honest consideration. She's going to know that you made serious mistakes, she said, and that when they were put in front of you completely, without the ability to manage or minimize them, you sat with them. You didn't argue. You didn't build a case for yourself. She paused. She's going to know that you chose correctly when choosing incorrectly. Cost you something. That it wasn't easy and you did it anyway. He looked at her. She met his eyes. That's more than a lot of people get, she said. That's not nothing. He looked back at Mara. His throat moved. No, he said quietly. It's not nothing. They sat for a while in the particular silence of a room where something has been said that does not need a response, and both people know it. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease. Seoul in November, always the same, the rain came in until it was done, and then it left without announcement. And the city afterward had that specific clean smell that Nia had learned in her first year here to associate with the beginning of something rather than the end. She had spent 3 years misreading that smell as novelty. She understood now that it was simply weather. It came back. It always came back. The city remained. She remained. Her mother had called that morning, before everything, and Naya had answered and said it was happening. And her mother had said, I'm on the first flight I can get. And Naya had said, you don't have to. And her mother had said, I know I don't have to, and had not finished the sentence because the rest of it was obvious. And they were women who did not finish sentences whose endings were obvious. Her mother would be in Seoul in 17 hours. She would walk into this room, and she would look at Mara with the expression Nia had seen her use on every significant arrival in their family's life, not soft, exactly, but something's underneath soft. The thing that lived below the composure of a woman who had raised a daughter to be competent and independent, and was now confronting the fact that the competence had been needed in ways that should not have been necessary. She would also look at Jae-hyun. Nia knew that look too. Had been anticipating it since Gijong. It would not be warm. It would not be cruel. Either her mother was not a cruel woman. It would be the look of a woman conducting a revised assessment, updating the model, cataloging what had changed and what had not, and what the difference between those two categories was worth. Jae-hyun would have to sit with that look the same way he had sat with everything else. Without arguing, without managing it, she thought he could do it. She was not certain, but she thought so. A nurse came in quietly around midnight to check on Mara, and then left without disturbing the specific atmosphere of the room, which was a skill Nia appreciated in the way she appreciated all professional competence with real, specific gratitude for the person who had bothered to develop it. Jae-hyun stood when the nurse left. He moved to the window. He stood there looking out at what remained of the rain, the Seoul night behind the glass, doing what it always did, never entirely dark, the city's own light, replacing whatever the sky withheld. I'm going to dismantle the Incheon operation entirely, he said. Not to her, not to her, not just the subsidiary. The whole communication structure that Min-suk built. The accounts, the relay system, all of it, he paused. There are parts of the organization that have been running on trust that was never verified. I've been operating on the assumption that loyalty purchased with enough time becomes real loyalty. Min-sik was the proof that that assumption was wrong. What are you going to do instead? She said. He turned from the window. Verify, he said. Audit. Build financial transparency into the structure the way you... He stopped. The way you would build it if it were yours to build. She looked at him. You're asking me. I'm telling you what I intend to do, he said carefully. If you have a different recommendation, I want to hear it. It was, she thought, a very small thing. A man saying I want to hear it and meaning it. In the context of who he was and how he had operated for his entire adult life, it was not a small thing at all. It was the kind of thing that took a person a long time to learn to say correctly, and he was saying it correctly, and she was not going to undervalue it, just because it had taken a crisis to get here. I'll look at the structure, she said, after I sleep for approximately 1 week. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. The beginning of one that this time, she noticed, did not decide at the last moment not to arrive. It arrived, briefly, and it was tired and genuine, and nothing like the controlled expressions she had catalogued across 3 years of watching his face in rooms full of people who were watching it too. It was the face he had when nobody was watching. She was watching. She filed it somewhere that was not cold and not precise. somewhere that did not have a professional name, somewhere that was simply hers. Mara makes a sound. Not a cry, something preliminary to a cry, the small announcement of a person preparing to have a need. Both of them looked at her simultaneously, with the identical instinctive alertness of two people who had not yet learned the taxonomy of their daughter's sounds and were not yet sure which sounds required what responses. Nia reached for her first. Mara settled. Jaehyun sat back down in his chair. He rested his forearms on his knees, and he looked at the two of them, his wife and his daughter, the woman who had disappeared before dawn and come back on her own terms, child who had been present and protected through all of it, without knowing any of it, and he was quiet in the way that was the thinking kind. Nia did not look at him. She was looking at Mara, but she was aware of him. The way you are aware of something that has been restructured into a position different in the room, not gone, the same, present in a way that requires new accounting. She was prepared to do the accounting. She was, after all, a woman who kept records.